29. What happened to the queen before me? Guinevere asked her maids one morning. Melway's words had returned to her, plaguing her sleep, so that she could not rest until she vowed to seek an answer. How did she die? The two girls looked at one another. Do you mean Queen Viviana, Princess Xylarander's mother? Guinevere reined in her impatience. The maids were not at fault for her own ignorance. If she was the last queen, then yes. Everyone thought she loved the king as much as he loved her, but one night when the king was away, she was discovered abed with one of Lord Melway's sworn knights. Lord Melway himself caught them, and in shame the queen took her own life. She buried a dagger in her breast. 'Twas said she could not face her husband, so she killed herself before the king returned. Guinevere shuddered. What a horrible end! What of the knight? Executed for treason at Lord Melway's command. That surprised her. Surely Melway would have rejoiced that his man had successfully seduced and dishonored the queen. She didn't doubt how happy he'd be if it had happened to her. My mother said she saw Lord Melway entering the queen's chambers, the first night the king was away. She heard the queen cry out, but he'd barred the door so she could not get in. The next morning the queen would not let anyone bathe her, but mother saw the bruises when she helped her dress. She said it went on for weeks. Fresh bruises every morning until the day the queen died. The other girl hushed her. He's Lord Regent now. You can't go accusing him of such things. You don't know what goes on here of a night, for you sleep in town and not the castle. Since the king's been ill, no woman in the castle is safe unless she's in the kitchen, for there's always someone about there. I've taken to sleeping in the corner by the pantry myself. Did you see Helga this morning? She could scarcely walk. Melway is a mean one and no mistake. What was wrong with men? First her father, now Melway and his late knight, not to mention the miners who had Xylander. They were little more than animals, rutting like it was their right to own women's bodies as well as their own. If a woman dared to take her pleasure of a man without his consent, there would be uproar, but if a man did it, whispered rumors and a warning to stay silent was all that happened. Guinevere wished her magic was stronger, capable of more than just a sleeping spell. She'd settle for turning Melway's manhood into a venomous snake that bit him and made him swell up purple and green until he died screaming. She hoped when Xylander found the men who had Xylander, he killed them all. While she watched, she dismissed her maids and settled down to watch the mirror while she broke her fast. Xylander had to be close now, and she didn't want to miss a moment. 30. Xylander passed the spot 3 times where the track ended, before he'd thought to push at what appeared to be an impenetrable hedge. Lo and behold, it was in fact a thin screen of branches fastened to a sackcloth frame that swung open at a touch. The cottage and the mine beyond were exactly as they had appeared in Guinevere's mirror, which meant the bruises he'd seen on Xylarander's face had not been a lie. How dare any man strike her, the heir to the throne no less? As if stealing salt were not treason enough. When Xylander was safely home in her castle, he would lead a troop of guards back here to deal justice in its most brutal form. He dismounted, leading his horse into a hidden dell on the other side of the screen, out of sight of both the cottage and the mine. He was a hunter, not some sort of berserker knight. His talents lay in stealth and cunning, not pitched battle against 7 burly men. Though if it came to it, he would have no qualms about drawing his sword and dispensing justice early. But that would upset Xylander, so it was best to keep violence to a last resort, at least while she was watching. Later the blood would flow. He crept back to the cottage, circling around it to see if there was any movement. No one was in sight, and the men kept no livestock, not even a goat for milk. Xylander watched for a while longer, before he decided the men could only be in either the house or the mine. A thin wisp of smoke curled up from the cottage chimney, and the scent of something savory reached him. Stew of some sort, he suspected. Someone was home. He chose a spot out of sight of the door and pressed his ear to the wooden wall. Not a sound reached his ears. Either they were all too busy eating, or the cook was the only person home. He listened longer, but there was no change. The cottage was as quiet as the grave. Uttering a quick prayer that he would find Xylander inside, he drew his sword. Holding the blade down by his side, hidden in the folds of his cloak, he pushed open the door. He put his back to the solid oak boards, and kept pushing until it hit the wall. No one hiding behind the door waiting to ambush him, then, but it took a moment for his eyes adjust to the dim interior. Movement, then a faint cry as someone stumbled, made him bring his blade up in readiness. "Please don't hurt me," came Xylander's plaintive cry. Xylander's heart constricted in his chest. No lady, let alone a princess, should have to utter such words with a knight in the room. "Are you alone?" he demanded. She nodded. "They are all at work." Then a peculiar expression came over her face. "But they will come for their noon meal as soon as I ring the bell." She pointed her spoon at a rusted cauldron that hung from the ceiling. Her unspoken words hung in the air, she could call aid in a moment. His heart twisted. She might fear the miners, but she did not trust him either. He closed the door behind him and sheathed his sword, holding his hands up in surrender. "I have come to rescue you from these terrible men, princess. Come and I shall take you home." He held out his hand. "You," she hissed, wide-eyed, as she scrambled away from him, deeper into the cottage. "You're her assassin. The knight she sent to kill me, not rescue me." His heart sank. "Princess, I swear to you, I mean you no harm." She crossed the patch of uneven straw that must serve as the communal bed, putting her back to the wall before she slowly rose to her feet. "How do you know who I am then?" "None of them know. No one would recognize me like this." She waved her hand at her peasant clothing. She wore a rough spun tunic, the muddy brown color helping her blend into the cottage wall, that ended halfway to her knees. Her white skirt hung in brown tatters beneath, as if she'd fought an army of thorn bushes. Or a pack of men intent on stealing her virtue. He forced that thought away. He had to win her trust before he could ask anything else. "I would recognize you anywhere, Your Highness," he admitted. "I first saw you in the tourney your father held for your name day. Your beauty bewitched me so that I could think of nothing else, least of all the lance coming toward me." She stared at him for a moment, before her eyes widened. "Are you the Green Knight?" He bowed his head. "To my endless shame, yes. My dented helmet stuck to my head, but even if it hadn't, my eyes were too full of the sight of you to see anything else that day. By the time I'd had help wrenching the helmet off, you were nowhere to be seen, and I had lost the tourney, so I dared not face you. I returned to Castrum recently, only to hear you were missing. I thought perhaps I might redeem myself in your eyes if I could rescue you from your captors. And here you are. Now we must flee before those wretched men return." Xylander's eyes took on a haunted, hollow cast. "I cannot come with you. They told me if I tried to leave they would hunt me down and drag me before Melwis, the lord of these lands, as a thief. And they will beat me." As they had already and would again if she remained, her eyes seemed to lament, though her lips fell silent. "But Lord Melwis is your cousin. Surely he would help you," Xylander began. She shook her head. "Melwis would likely not recognize me like this. I barely recognize me, and if they bruise my face anymore, my own father would not know me. And if by some miracle Melwis did manage to identify me, he would force me into a marriage I do not want. He would lock me in his dungeons until I agreed to do his bidding, just like he did to my mother. It will be the death of me, for I would welcome the kiss of a blade far more readily than my cousin's touch. I am safer here. With the common men in this cottage? Men who beat you and treat you like a servant? Who share your bed?" Fury choked him up too much to continue. Her eyes blazed. "They are as chivalrous as any knight. There is but one bed, yes, but none of them has dared lay a hand upon me, and should one man even suggest it, his fellows beat the idea out of his head. They only beat me if I fail to cook a meal to their liking, which is my fault. I deserved this, she said, waving at her face. I lied, saying I knew how to cook. But if I told them the truth, they would take me to Melwes or to her. Xylander shook his head. Poor innocent princess, she had no idea of the wager the men had made. A wager she would pay the price for if she stayed here. And if she left, he had to make sure the men could not follow her. He took a deep breath. If I swear on my life and all I hold dear, that I will keep you safe and take you from here to wherever you wish to go, and no one, be they a lord or an assassin or anyone, will touch you again without your consent, let alone beat you or throw you in a dungeon, would you trust me enough to come with me? She bit her lip. There was longing in her eyes, longing to believe him, he hoped, but she shook her head. You can't protect me from all of them. There are 7 big strong men and they will follow us. He caught her hands in his. I have a swift horse and I know the woods as well as any hunter. They may try to follow but they will not find us. I swear to you, princess. Tears filled her eyes as she opened her mouth to refuse again. He touched a finger to her lips. I will return on the morrow and I will save you. Until then, rest, for we will have a long journey ahead of us. She shrugged off his touch. How can I sleep, knowing that on the morrow I will meet my doom? At your hands or theirs or Melwes, what does it matter? Things will turn out well. This I swear to you, Xylander said desperately, though he did not yet know how. Somehow, between now and the morrow, he had to kill 7 men and survive to save the princess. He needed a plan, and probably a miracle too. Or magic. Which gave him an idea. Do you still have my magic apple? The one she'd stolen from him in the woods, after one bite had sent him to sleep. Her eyes narrowed for a moment, before she thrust her hand into her pocket, and pulled out the apple. It looked like he'd taken a bite from it, barely a moment before, not days ago. A magic apple indeed. I thought it was poisoned when you fell over dead, she said. The thought of Guinevere poisoning anyone, let alone him, made Xylander laugh. It was a gift from my sister to help me sleep, no more. A bite from that apple grants me the sweetest night's sleep I have ever known. Here, lie down, take a bite and see. She lifted up the apple, squinting at it. After the men have eaten their noon meal. It is almost ready and they will be angry with me if I burn it, or call them too late. A shudder shook her shoulders. Resolve hardened within Xylander. These bastards who dared to beat his princess would not live past the morrow. He would kill them all himself. Only then would she be safe. Then I will return on the morrow, princess. Until then, I pray that your dreams will be sweet. Xylander bowed and left. It sat ill with him to leave her with the men another night, but the clear skies promised it would not snow today or tomorrow, so she should be safe. All he needed was a plan to kill 7 men armed with picks and axes and shovels, while all he carried was a single sword. There had to be a way to complete his quest. And if he stayed awake all night, he would find it, and enact it. For with Zurin's life at stake, he could not live with himself if he did any less. 31. No, you fool, go back in there and carry her out. You would not leave me in such danger. She's barely half your size, even if she fights you, you must. Guinevere hissed at the image of her brother in the mirror, but neither Zurin or Xylander heard her. Just as long as the guard outside the door did not hear her either. The last time the physician knight had heard her talking to herself, he'd summoned Lancelot, convinced she'd managed to sneak someone into her chamber to conspire with. Lancelot had duly searched her chamber, while his colleague kept watch from the doorway. She'd stood with her arms folded across her breast, not having to feign her disdain for their baseless suspicions. After peering under all the furniture, Lancelot had declared himself satisfied, and turned to leave. But what about in the chests? You could hide a man or even two in one of those, the physician had insisted. Dutifully, Lancelot had gone through her gowns, laying them one by one on the bed until an armload of fabric slithered out of the folds of the golden gown. Guinevere's cheeks had grown hot as Lancelot lifted up a silk shift, so gossamer thin she could see straight through it. The king had gifted her with half a dozen such scandalous shifts, and the one time she dared to try wearing one, the sensuous slide of silk over her skin had made her think of a lover's hands, of doing things a maiden should not be considering. So she'd stuffed them inside the gold silk skirt, too embarrassed to look at them again. Lancelot's eyes had seemed to burn into her very soul at that moment, as if he could read her thoughts. She ducked her head, but it was too late. The queen is clearly not hiding anyone in her undergarments, she'd heard him say, before he returned her things to their proper place and shut the lid. Leave the queen to her solitude, Tristan, for she is surely praying for the king's recovery. The moment he'd left, she'd pressed her burning cheeks against the stone walls to cool them, but she hadn't been able to shake the thought of a lover's hands stroking her through silk. Especially if those strong hands belonged to Sir Lancelot. But now she shook the memory from her mind. Xylander had climbed a tree from which he could observe the cottage and its inhabitants, and Xurine remained inside. Guinevere didn't trust the girl. There was something wild in the way she'd spoken to Xylander, more like a spooked horse than a damsel whose distress would soon be at an end. Xurine heard a sound, the voices of the men leaving the mine no doubt, and her frightened expression turned to one of firm resolve. "If I cannot have my prince, then none shall have me," Xurine said. She lifted the apple to her lips and took a bite. Then another. Her eyelids drooped, but determination drove her. She wolfed down the apple even as she swayed, falling to her knees on the straw pallet, until finally nothing but the core remained. It rolled out of her hand as she subsided on the straw, falling into an enchanted sleep so deep, her chest barely rose with each shallow breath. A slumber so complete, one might think the princess was dead. 32. If he could collapse the mine entrance or somehow block it, he might be able to take them all out at once, Xylander mused. But without a siege weapon like a trebuchet, which would take far more than a day to build, there was no way he'd be able to accomplish such a feat without a small army. He could possibly fell one of the bigger oak trees, which, if it fell just right, would block the entrance, though he doubted it would be heavy enough to collapse it. If he were to venture inside the mine to inspect it, while the men were asleep perhaps, he might find a way to sabotage one of the tunnels or the entrance itself, but he would have to be close to spring the trap. Close enough to possibly get caught in the cave-in, and what would happen to Xurine then? He had a crossbow in his saddlebag. It was not the most honorable of weapons, but he'd used it against a boar or two when one of his companions' spears had broken. Saved the man's life too. But there was little honor in slaughtering this kind of common filth, so what did it matter if he shot them with a crossbow? The very oak he'd considered felling to block the mine entrance would make a good vantage point from which to target the men as they came out. In less than a minute he could dispatch all 7 if his aim was true and he did not miss. And if they did not realize where he was shooting from and take shelter. What if? Voices drew his attention to the mine entrance. 4 men had already emerged, shouldering their mining tools as they headed back to the house. But Xurine had not rung the bell to summon them to dinner. Why had they come out early? Did they know he was here? Xylander retreated deeper into the foliage, praying they would not see him. If he lost the element of surprise, then it was still just 1 man against 7, and Xurine would be the loser. Something he could not allow to happen. 7 men moved in single file to the cottage, propping their tools up against the wall before they went in. If Xurine were not inside, he might set fire to the place, trapping them inside. Xylander dismissed that idea as quickly as it had come. Too dangerous, for Xurine was surely asleep inside and he did not dare risk her. "Why is our dinner not ready?" one of the men roared. "Do you need reminding of your duties?" He raised his fist, striding inside. "The slatten's asleep," someone else said. "Then get her up. Who does she think she is, lying abed when there is work to be done?" Someone sniggered. "The Queen, maybe. All the Queen does is lie on her back for the king." "She won't wake." This voice sounded panicked. "She's not breathing." "She can't be dead. We have a wager." "Someone came into our house and slew her while we worked? When I find the man, I'll bury my pick in his belly, I will." "There's no blood or blade. Naught but this apple core." The offending core flew out of the door. Xylander's heart stopped. One bite of the apple would have sent her to sleep. To eat the whole thing, she might sleep for weeks or never wake at all. Unless someone broke the spell. Guinevere had told him how once, but he was damned if he could remember. All he knew was that it didn't need a witch to break the spell. "What'll we do?" a man wailed. "We'll put her in the meat chest, so she'll stay fresh. First snowfall can't be that far off, a few days maybe. When it comes, we'll pull her out and have her then. She'll last longer if she don't fight back. We might each get 2 or 3 turns at her." They thought she was dead, yet they intended to violate her corpse. These men were worse than animals. Xylander clenched his fists as he watched one man carry her limp body from the cottage to the mine. "Will she fit?" worried a man who trotted close on the first man's heels. "Of course she will," said another, striding behind. "We had 2 boars in there last summer, remember? The meat stayed fresh for months." They intended to place her in a chest where they'd kept pigs. Xylander's rage simmered, close to boiling. "We could keep her in there for months, take her out at night for a poke, then put her back. Like having a whore you don't need to pay." No one called Xylander a whore. The 7th man disappeared inside the mine as Xylander slid down the tree. The moment his feet touched the ground, he drew his sword. He glanced at the mining tools, discarded by the door. 7 unarmed pigs, waiting to be slaughtered. He didn't have long to wait. The first man emerged, hauling himself out of the hole and onto the turf. He never even saw the sword that pierced his throat. He was dead before he could make a sound. Xylander kicked the corpse aside. The second man was the one who'd called her a whore. Blinded by rage, Xylander lost all control. Some time later, he did not know how long, he paused to catch his breath. Had he gotten them all? He glanced around. He counted 6, no 7 heads, for the last had rolled down the slope after he lopped it off. The turf was now more red than green, so he wiped his blade on a dead man's tunic before sheathing it. Some of them must have fought back, he realized, tasting blood as he massaged his aching jaw. But it hadn't been enough to save them. Nothing would. Now nothing stood between him and Xylander. He would save her, just as he promised. Xylander slid down the ladder, into the darkness. 33. Xylander followed the light of a flickering candle to the chamber where Xylander lay. The walls glittered, throwing back reflections like pools of water, if ever water pooled vertically. Salt crunched underfoot, but he paid it no heed. Xylander was all that mattered, and she could not be dead. When he entered her chamber, he gasped. What those dullards had called their meat chest was in fact an enormous casket, carved out of salt so clear he could see her inside it. Xylander lay sleeping beneath an equally transparent lid that was little more than a giant slab of salt. Xylander levered it aside and reached inside to pull her out. He touched her bruised throat and almost cried when he felt her faint pulse. She lived, and once he worked out how to wake her. A few drops of cold water on her neck did not rouse her, nor did calling her name. He wished Guinevere were here, it was her blood that had cast the spell, so she would certainly know how to undo it. Blood? Was that the answer? He touched his still bleeding lip, split by a lucky punch before he'd hacked the man's hand from his arm, and his fingers came away red. Lightly he brushed his blood-stained fingers against her throat, and waited. But she did not wake. By all that was holy, how had one of his hunting party broken the spell before? He'd drunk too much wine and taken a bite of one of Guinevere's apples to stave off the hangover, but one of his men had stumbled over him in the dark, kicking him in the face. He'd awoken with the taste of blood in his mouth, and a curse on his lips for every clumsy, drunken fool who'd ever. Was that it? She had to taste blood to wake? No. Xylander shied away from even the thought of raising a hand against her. He was not like the men who had kept her captive. He'd come to save her, not hurt her further. But perhaps a drop of his blood. Guinevere had told tales of princesses awoken by a kiss, but he had not believed them. Yet, he leaned over and lightly touched his lips to hers. For a moment she stiffened, and then her lips parted. To kiss him back. For the second time that afternoon, Xylander lost control. Her kiss blinded him, drenching his senses until he could see and feel nothing but her. Could not taste the blood, but a faint trace of apple. She shoved him away. How dare you, assassin! Somehow she'd managed to get her hands on his dagger, which she now pointed at him. Xylander backed away. I mean you no harm, princess, I swear. He swallowed. I only kissed you to break the spell, to save you. I will not die dishonored. Not at your hands or theirs. I will not share my mother's fate, she said, turning the dagger until it pointed at her own breast. No. He dived forward, wresting the weapon from her before she could plunge it into her flesh. I am not an assassin, I told you. Then who are you? She demanded. He could resist her no longer. He tried and failed. I am Prince Xylander, come to claim you as my bride. But when you disappeared, I set out to find you. That first night I had hoped to persuade you to return with me, but you ran from me. I searched and searched until I found you here. I vowed to bring you safely home to Castrum, for that is where you belong. At my side if you'll have me. Her eyes widened. You're the prince my father promised? Xylander bowed his head. Your father sent a messenger to my father, summoning me to Castrum to claim you. Since the day of the tourney I have thought of no one else. Yet when I saw you in the great hall, you stole my breath away with your beauty. I am and have always been your prince. He bowed low before her. She rose unsteadily to her feet, and Xylander moved to help her. You're really real? She asked, wondering eyes shimmering with tears. Yes, your highness. You saved me. She threw herself at his chest and burst into tears. 34. People rushed through the corridors of the castle, their voices raised in panic. Something was happening, but no one had dared open the door to tell Guinevere what. She would have to ask the maid who brought her noon meal, she decided. Unless Xylander had returned with the princess. Guinevere hurried to the mirror, which she'd ignored for some days now. Knowing Xylander had succeeded in winning Xuran's heart, and each day brought them closer to Castrum, she hadn't felt the need to check on their progress. That, and the couple spent an inordinate amount of time kissing. Fortunately, she seemed to have caught them at a moment their tongues weren't tangled together, as they rode through the forest. We'll reach the road soon, princess. When we do, it's less than a day's ride to Castrum. I'll have you in your own bed by nightfall, Xylander said. Xuran giggled. And I thought you wanted to wait until after we were wed. What if I plan to have you in your bed tonight instead, my prince? Guinevere hurriedly told the mirror to show her reflection before the conversation turned any more intimate. She didn't want to know what her brother and his, hopefully soon-to-be wife, wanted to do to each other in bed. But if they were still a day away, then the castle commotion could not be because of their arrival. Hope sparked in her breast. Maybe a miracle had occurred, and the king had recovered. Obedient to her mind's desire, the mirror showed an image of Artorius, lying unmoving in his bed. People moved around the periphery, blocking her vision, until a voice she recognized at Lancelot said roughly, "Move aside. The physician is here." A true physician, and not the knight she called by that name, shuffled forward, and the crowd parted. Guinevere's heart sank, feeling for all the world like it had turned to stone within her chest and dropped into a bottomless well. The grey-faced corpse in the king's bed had taken all hope from her when he drew his last breath. Regret washed over her. She, as his wife, should have held his hand in his final moments, waking him from the sleeping spell to let him say a final farewell, if he'd been capable of such a thing. If he died alone. She stared at the mirror. "Can you show me how he died?" she asked. The image blurred, then cleared. The same man in the same bed, but now Artorius only appeared to be sleeping, his face a pink picture of health on one side, still drooping on the other. "Your time is over, old man," said a voice Guinevere also recognized. "Melwis." She watched in horror as Melwis took one of the king's pillows and placed it over his face. He held it down for what seemed an eternity, before he finally took it away again. Artorius, still enchanted by her sleeping spell, had not even fought for his last breath, nor had he been aware of it. That living, sleeping face had turned as grey as the shadow that now lay over the kingdom. A kingdom ruled by the king's killer. She wasn't sure what was worse in a king, her father's madness, or Melwis's mad quest for power. She wished she had played more at politics, in her father's court as well as here. Perhaps then she would know how to cheat Melwis out of his stolen crown. Instead, her mother had trained her in how to hold a funeral or coronation feast, neither of which she would be allowed to plan, with Lady Ragnar ruling the castle. When Xylander returned, she would tell him of Melway's crimes, and he could bring the man to justice. As Dowager Queen, any power she might have had as Artorius's wife would now pass to Zurine. She would surely help Xylander, for she was certainly no friend of Melway's. She sat on the end of her bed, wishing she could do more than wait. But there was no work to be done, her hands sat idle. The door burst open and Melwis stood there, his eyes bulging in his red face as if the king had tried to suffocate him and not the other way around. "There's the traitorous witch. Seize her." Guards spilled into the room, grabbing her arms and crowding around her so she could not escape, even if she'd had a mind to, or anywhere else to go. "Can you hear them?" Melwis asked. The scurrying servants? Of course she'd heard them, but as Guinevere listened, she realized the sounds outside had grown louder. No longer individual shouts, from outside there came a swelling roar. "They're baying for your blood, witch. They want justice for their murdered king," Melwis hissed. Even her patience had its limits. She would not let him get away with this. "You," she began. Something struck the back of her head, and blackness won. 35. The roaring in Guinevere's ears only made her head pound all the more. Her arms hurt too, and she could scarcely feel her hands. She'd expected cold, metal manacles, but instead rough rope wrapped around her wrists, dragging her arms high above her head so that her slippered toes only just touched the stone floor. She wanted to shout to Melwis that he would regret this, but the gag in her mouth turned her words into a garbled mess. Someone grabbed her hair, pulling hard. "Here she is. The traitor who seduced and killed your king. What would you have me do with her? Burn her. Hang her. Flay the flesh from her bones. Put out her eyes. Cut off her head. A week in the stocks, naked. Burn the bitch." She could not shut out the voices, for there were too many of them. But Guinevere had never been a coward. She would meet the eyes of her accusers, even if she could not speak in her defense. Something scratchy tickled her ankles. Straw forked onto the stone platform beneath her feet by two burly farmers whose cries of "Burn her!" seemed to light an unholy fire in their eyes. The straw piled up beneath her until her heels sank into it, taking some of her weight from her aching arms. She'd expected a dungeon, but Melwys had taken her instead to the public square, and tied her to the whipping post where common criminals received their punishment. The stocks stood empty before her. Melwys had not wanted anyone else distracting the mob. Traitors to the crown must die. Hanging's too good for her. I say she should burn like the devil she worships. Melwys shouted. Cries of assent drowned out the suggestions for other punishments they wanted her to endure first. Melwys met her eyes, and Guinevere did her best to glare back. As soon as Xylander arrived, he would save her. She knew it. You could have warmed my bed, like Viviana did before you. But you're as stupid and stubborn as Xylander, like all women, which is why men are born to rule. Smart women are obedient, lying on their backs and taking what they're given. Even the women in the crowd know that. Melwys swept a hand around, encompassing the screaming mob. They want the king's killer, and I'm giving them you. She tried to bite through the gag, to scream that she knew he was the king's killer, not her, but she did not have the strength. A gap opened up in the crowd to let a cart through. Men climbed atop it to take the wood, throwing it at her feet, piling it around the little stone platform until she stood on a pyre. Lord Regent. The princess has returned. The crowd fell silent, faggots falling from suddenly hesitant hands. Melwys looked around, his panic showing for just a moment, before he shouted, "Keep piling it up. I will go tell the princess we have caught the traitor, and when we return together we shall watch her burn." A ragged cheer rose up, and the pyre began to pile higher. If the princess heard, then so would Xylander, and he would come to save her. He had to. As long as he was in time. Silently, Guinevere prayed for a miracle. 36. Xylander dozed against Xylander's back, half hidden beneath his cloak. The soft warmth of her brought a smile to his lips that would not leave his face. Not even when he answered the guard's challenge as he approached the city gates. "I have brought Princess Xylander safe home," he announced, when the guard seemed unlikely to open the gates for him. Gasps went up, and Xylander stirred. "You are home, princess," he murmured. "What's happening over in the square?" she asked sleepily. Xylander turned to survey the crowd. "Someone is tied to the whipping post. An execution or punishment of some sort. Blood always does get the common people excited." Xylander shuddered. Her arms tightened around him. "Please, I don't want to see. Take me home." "As my princess commands," he said, turning his horse away. "We will send word to Lord Regent Melwys that the princess has returned," one of the guards said. "Tell whoever you please, but she needs rest and will see no one before the morrow," Xylander said. "Lord Melwys will want." "I don't care what Melwys wants. He is not the king here," Xylander snapped. The guard's eyes widened. "But the king is dead, and Lord Melwys is regent until Princess Xylander is crowned queen. Then send word to the castle to prepare for her coronation." "My father is dead?" Xylander buried her face in his shoulder and wept. "Oh, Xylander." The guard squinted at him. "And who are you to be giving orders?" This was the moment he had hoped never to happen, but for Xylander he would do it. "I am Prince Xylander, Princess Xylander's betrothed, and your future king." 37. The wood had piled so high, Guinevere could no longer see the crowd, though she could hear them. Still Xylander did not come. Doubt began to creep in. A proper princess would have been rescued by now, but no matter how much she'd loved her mother's tales, she'd never expected to be in one. If today was her day to die, then she would do so with dignity. No tears, for queens did not cry where her people could see. She prayed her brother would forgive her for saddling him with the throne he had not wanted, and that he would forgive himself when he arrived too late. Perhaps no one could have saved her. She felt a kinship with Queen Viviana, who had at least been able to choose the time and method of her death, but Melwys had not made the mistake of leaving Guinevere with a blade. Then she might have been able to cut her hands free and take the only escape open to her, for Guinevere could not escape the mob milling around the square. A shadow fell on her. Someone standing atop the stacked wood. She stared steadily at the branch before her, refusing to meet the eyes of a man who believed Melway's lies. Something flashed overhead. The rope holding her wrists fell away and her arms dropped heavily to her sides, twin dead weights, as her hands began to tingle painfully with returning circulation. A hand appeared before her face. "Take it, my queen." "Not Xylander." She tried to clasp his hand, but her stiff fingers would not do her bidding. After a long moment, he reached down and seized her around the waist instead, drawing her up beside him. "She is still your queen," Lancelot thundered. "How dare you judge her? The king is barely cold in his bed, and this is how you treat his beloved queen?" The shouts that had been so sure before sounded uncertain now in the face of Lancelot's cold fury. "The new queen will be crowned, and she will stand in judgment. Until then, anyone who so much as whispers a word against Queen Guinevere will answer to me." Lancelot lifted Guinevere into his arms, as effortlessly as she suspected he'd done for many a damsel. "Go home, good people of Castrum. Go home and mourn your king." The crowd parted for him, leaving him a clear path to the castle. A princess would have swooned, but Guinevere clung stubbornly to consciousness, concentrating on freeing herself from her gag. When the crowd was far enough behind them not to hear her, she said, "I can walk, you know." "Better that they see your weakness, my queen." "Save your strength," Lancelot said. "For the trial ahead. It should be Melwys on trial, not her." "I didn't kill the king," she snapped. "Melwys did. Suffocated him in his sleep. With a cushion." Lancelot's tone did not change. Calm and steady, like she wished her heartbeat was right now. "And how do you know this, my queen? Did you see him do it?" "In a fashion," she said. Ah, what did she have left to lose? Only her life, and she owed that to him anyway. "I will show you." "And the princess." "You will show me. I will decide what to show the princess." Slowly, Guinevere nodded. That seemed fair. "There is a mirror on the wall of my chamber. A magic mirror. Bring it to me and I shall show you all I can." Lancelot nodded once. No one paid them any heed as they entered the castle. Guinevere expected to be taken to the dungeons, but instead Lancelot carried her to a small spare chamber that held a narrow bed, a chest and little else. "Please stay here until I return. Rest if you can," he said, moving to close the door. "Thank you," she said. He bowed. "I am only doing my duty, my queen." The door closed, leaving her alone with the evening light streaming in through the high window. A window opened to the sky and a door he had not locked. Definitely not a dungeon. Guinevere looked longingly at the bed, but she could not rest. Instead, she paced the narrow chamber, 7 steps up and another 7 back, until she caught her toe on the side of the chest and swore. She kicked it, and the lid fell open. A blazon of azure blue, embroidered with a silver sword, sat on top. Lancelot's, which made this his chamber. Why had he brought her here? He soon returned, carrying a sack full of clothes and the mirror. "I think it might be prudent to take you out of the city, to somewhere safe, where Melwys cannot easily reach you. I would suggest Xurine do the same, but he cannot turn the city against her as readily as they turned on you, and someone from the royal family must stay to stand against him." King Artorius did not trust the man, and there were always rumors surrounding him, but no one ever came to accuse him in court. That in itself is odd. Why, I think he is the only courtier who has never had a charge brought against him. No man can be such a paragon that no one complains about him." Guinevere smiled faintly. "How many times have you been accused of a crime in court?" "Not once," she was willing to wager. "At least once a month," Lancelot said. "More if Sir Hector's gout is not bothering him." She blinked in surprise. "With what imagined crime?" It was Lancelot's turn to smile. "'Tis always the same. I offered Sir Kay or Sir Hector a mortal insult, and one or the other demands reparation." "Which guards were they?" she asked. "Oh, I would not trust either of them to guard your chamber, my queen, so you may not have met them. They are both arguably the worst swordsmen in His Majesty's troop of knights. Perhaps even the whole kingdom. Sir Hector was once tolerable, but he has grown soft at court, and between his girth and his gout, his balance is not what it was. Sir Kay, well, we were fostered together in Sir Hector's household. He is built like a bull, and he charges into every battle with all the finesse of a battering ram. In a sword fight against an opponent with the slightest bit of skill, he wouldn't last 3 seconds. Both men take any comment on their lack of sword skills as a mortal insult, up to and including the simple statement that I've won a training bout against either one of them." He shrugged. "One of them would bring a complaint, and the king would listen with more patience than I confess to owning, before ordering us to conduct a trial by combat, as is customary among knights for lesser crimes such as these." "Trials you won easily," Guinevere guessed. "A man must defend his honor," Lancelot replied matter-of-factly, before his expression tightened. "As must you, my queen. You accused Melwys of killing the king. While I believe there is much to distrust about the man, I did not think him so without scruples as to kill his kinsman." She set the sack on the floor and took the mirror in both hands. "Show me the king's final moments before he died," she instructed the looking-glass. When the glass misted, she held it up so that Lancelot might see what it showed. Guinevere wanted to turn away, but she could not bring herself to do so. Nevertheless, when she saw Artorius's grey, lifeless face, she was conscious of tears tracking down her cheeks. A queen did not cry before her subjects, she scolded herself, swiping her sleeve across her face before Lancelot saw. He sniffled and, to her amazement, appeared to wipe a tear from his own eye. "A terrible loss both to you and the kingdom," he said. "His Majesty did not deserve to die at the hands of such a man. He would have wanted to die fighting, like he lived." Tears flooded down her cheeks now as she felt the barb of his reproach. "He did fight. I woke to him fighting his own body that first morning. A body he could no longer control. To fight would have only killed him faster, and I could not bear to see him die. I saw the fear in his eyes, and I cast a sleeping spell over him. There was nothing else I could do. Yet, if I had not and he had survived, perhaps he might have been able to fight off Lord Melwys. Maybe. No, my queen. His physicians said he was dying. Perhaps you prolonged the end a little with your sleep spell, but the outcome would have been the same. To fall in battle is to know failure. Death in glorious battle might have been what he wanted, but he deserved better. You granted him the peaceful death he deserved, for few men have the luxury of dying in their sleep." She managed a small smile, wiping her face again for what she swore would be the last time. "Thank you for your kind words of comfort, Sir Lancelot. I am grateful that you chose not to offer me a mortal insult instead." He bowed. To insult such a beautiful queen would be a crime indeed. "But if I may offer a suggestion." His gaze dropped to the sack at her feet. "I must speak to the princess before we depart, and make my men aware of what Melwys had done, but while I am gone, I pray that you use the time to dress in clothing suitable for travel. Stout boots if you have them instead of court slippers." Guinevere glanced down. She'd lost one slipper somehow between leaving her chamber and arriving here, and wisps of straw clung to the remaining one. She must look more like a slovenly stable girl than a queen. As if reading her thoughts, Lancelot added, There's water in the jug and a comb on the table as well if you have need of them. Give her a day stuffing mattresses with fresh straw instead of the political play of life at court, Guinevere thought. If the knight had noticed how bad she looked, she must look frightful indeed. Still she had her pride. She drew herself up. Do what you must. I will be ready when you return. 38. Lancelot found Xylander in her father's chamber. The king's body was gone, taken to be prepared for tomorrow's funeral in the cathedral. For a moment, Lancelot wished he could stay for the funeral, to pay his final respects to the man who'd been the closest thing he'd known to a father, but he knew he could not. As if Artorius himself had stood there to remind him, he was a knight loyal to the crown, and he would carry out his king's commands. Especially his final one. He'd thought the princess was too deep in thought to be aware of his entrance, but he was mistaken. I still can't believe he's dead, Lancelot. Can you? She asked, her eyes fixed on the very pillow that had stolen his final breath. The dead are never truly gone, or so the priests say, Lancelot said. But he had lived a long and happy life. If he could speak now, I'm sure he would say it was definitely his time. But I never got a chance to thank him. He was so busy with his silly wedding that he didn't get to tell me my prince had come. So I couldn't thank him. She sighed deeply. What prince is that, Your Highness? He asked. For unless the man was hiding under the bed, he was nowhere to be seen. Prince Xylander. He saved me from the men holding me captive. A true hero. He will make a wonderful king, she said. A dreamy smile lit her face. Father found him for me. And where is he now? Lancelot pressed. She waved a hand aimlessly. I told him I wanted to be alone with my father's memory, so he went to guard my chamber from assassins. While she sat here alone, with no guard at all. Then again, this was the first he'd heard of any assassins. Well, except for Melwis of course, but assassin did not seem the right word for the king's murderer. To call him an assassin implied there had been some skill involved. Still, only he, the queen and Melwis knew of his crime, or so Lancelot thought. Had there been others involved? Who told you there were assassins in the castle? He asked. The queen. Well, I overheard her. Telling an assassin to bring her my heart, of all things. I fled from the castle. I could not live under the same roof with a woman who wanted someone to cut my heart from my breast. Xylander pressed a hand to her chest, breathing hard. For a long moment, Lancelot feared she'd swoon. Instead, she engaged in a lesser evil, she burst into noisy tears. Is it wrong that I want her dead? No. What he knew of Guinevere, she could not have done such a thing. Perhaps you misheard. Or mistook her for someone else. Lancelot began. Xylander sniffled. No. She was in her chamber, and I heard her as clearly as I hear you now. I don't want her here or at my father's funeral. Where is she? Caution held his tongue. Somewhere safe, he said. I will take her outside the city into the forest and see that she does not return. Let Xylander make of that what she would. She'd surely forget about Guinevere before the week was out, too caught up in her own new duties as queen. Xylander nodded stiffly. Good. I don't want to see her again. I can't imagine what possessed my father to marry her in the first place. Lancelot rarely betrayed the king's confidences, but he suspected Artorius would forgive him this once. He suspected his time was short, and he hoped she might be a fitting companion for you, when you are queen. He was inclined to agree with Artorius. Guinevere was more of a queen than Xylander would ever be. Guinevere's steadying influence might have helped Xylander to come to terms with being a ruler with responsibilities, instead of the pampered princess she'd been all her life. The horror on Xylander's face said she most certainly did not agree with either of them. Then my father had gone mad. No. Artorius had been quite lucid that last night. As sane a man as he could hope, with perhaps a little more foresight than most. "I'm sure he did what he thought best," Lancelot said. Xylander considered this a moment. "Maybe. At least he got me my prince in the end." Lancelot sighed. "Too selfish to see sense. Princess, I should warn you about Lord Melwis. I am here to mourn my father. After the funeral I have a wedding and a coronation to prepare for. Lord Melwis can wait until after that." "But Princess, this cannot wait." She screwed up her face in the obstinate stare she'd used for as long as Lancelot could remember. She'd probably shown a similar expression before throwing tantrums for her wet nurse. "Then tell it to Prince Xylander. He will be your new king. A stranger on Artorius's throne." Lancelot knew his king had hoped Xylander might come to her senses one day and take up her duties as ruler, but the girl's father had been too optimistic. Perhaps in a decade, she might grow up and into the queen her predecessor had been. For Guinevere had known her duties better than Xylander. He suppressed a sigh and headed off to find one of his men to take a message to the prince, telling him to watch out for Melwis, who was suspected of killing the king. Let this new prince sort things out here, for it was no longer Lancelot's responsibility. Lancelot had sworn to see Guinevere safe, and he would do his duty. 39. Guinevere washed and dressed in haste, so she had plenty of time to regard her own wan reflection in the mirror before asking it to show her Lancelot instead. "I will take her outside the city into the forest and see that she does not return." His grim words and matching expression made her wish she hadn't spied upon him, but it was too late. He'd saved her from a public execution, only to take her into the forest to kill her in secret instead. Guinevere had to face the truth. Her father wanted to kill her, her brother was too caught up in his new bride to care about her, and the man who'd saved her life intended to kill her at the first opportunity, for his loyalty lay to a crown she would no longer wear. Her first thought was to run, but she knew her running days were done. She had nowhere left to run to, and even if she did, Lancelot would find her. A man bound by honor would not rest until he'd done his duty. It was time to surrender to the inevitable. Guinevere was no fairy tale princess, to be saved by some hero for a life lived happily ever after, filled with love. That was the fate of Xylander and her ilk. Guinevere herself had been painted too clearly as the evil usurping queen, who had time to enjoy her throne and crown for but a moment. Until the new queen replaced her at the end, and this was the end. Lancelot returned, talking of the need to hurry. He made no comment on her gown, the same white wool she'd worn when she entered court that first time. She hadn't bothered with a veil, though she could hide her hair beneath her cloak if Lancelot said she should. He did not. A dutiful daughter, then a dutiful queen, soon to be a dead one. Perhaps that was the duty of all queens, to die young. Like her mother, or Xylander's mother Viviana. She would see them both soon surely and be able to ask them. With her wrists tied together and attached to Lancelot's saddle by a stout length of rope that hung between her horse and his, Guinevere was left in no doubt that she was the knight's prisoner. The people of the capital knew it too as they parted to let them through, though Lancelot's frequent shouts that he was taking her to a place where she could do no harm and that she was under his protection drove the message home like a nail in the coffin that should have been hers. Now she would forever sleep in a shallow grave in the forest, while the wriggling creatures that lived in the soil came to devour her corpse. "Are you cold, my queen?" His solicitous tone startled Guinevere out of her morbid thoughts. They were on the road outside the city, with the walls looming up behind her like a monster preparing to strike. The shivers that racked her were not cold. They were fear, the biggest monster of all that had dogged her steps for longer than she could remember. Why did she fear the end so? It was inevitable, after all. Why fear what she could not fight or stop? "Here, take my cloak." The thick layer of wool that settled on her shoulders startled her. It was still warm from his body, and his hands were warmer still as they grazed her skin to fasten the cloak at her throat. "Why?" she croaked, her throat too rough for her voice to come out right. "Why are you doing this?" Instead of riding ahead, he kept pace with her. "Because it is my duty. I swore an oath, and I am no oath-breaker." "What kind of oath?" "To take me into the forest and kill me?" That's what Xylander wanted, for she believed Guinevere had sent Xylander to kill her. Her fool of a brother getting things wrong only to save the girl at the last moment. A fate he could have avoided if he'd only listened. "No, you have nothing to fear from me, my queen. My oath, 'twas one I swore to the king." Artorius or Xylander? For a moment, she entertained a spark of hope. If it was Xylander. King Artorius, may God rest his noble soul. Hope died. "So we ride all night, or until I fall off my horse and you drag me behind you to my death? Is this how this ends?" she asked bitterly. "No, we ride until we reach my preferred camp. We will stay there for the night, and ride on in the morning." And that was all the answer she was going to get, it seemed, as he nudged his horse ahead of her. Guinevere lost track of time as they rode on in silence. Finally, when she could no longer hear or see the city behind her through the trees, Lancelot led her off the road, onto a bridle path through the forest. The path soon opened up into a clearing, with a fire pit in the middle of it. Lancelot set down his lantern beside the unlit fire, and started to unsaddle his horse. Then he sat down to light the fire. Still on her horse, unable to get down with her wrist tied, Guinevere lost patience. "Are you going to leave me up here all night?" "Of course not, your majesty. I did not realize you would need assistance to dismount." He hurried over. If she'd been the vindictive sort, she might have kicked him. "Normally I can dismount just fine, but I do not normally suffer the indignity of rope around my wrists." "Ah, of course. I forgot. Allow me to assist." She expected him to pull out a knife to cut her bonds, but he untied them instead, coiling the rope up on the ground beside his saddlebags. "No sense wasting a good length of rope," he said cheerfully, offering her his hand. She ignored it and slid from her horse. "Of course not. Not when I'm sure you intend to tie me up again so I don't run off while you sleep." "Where are you planning on running to, my queen?" he asked, heading back to the fire with a log to toss on the flames. "To the capital, where the people wish to burn you as a traitor? Or back to your homeland, which you were so desperate to leave you came to throw yourself on my king's mercy?" She had no answer, so she stayed silent. "If you had wanted to run, you would have found a way to do so long ago. You might have departed the morn after your wedding night, before anyone discovered the king's illness. Or you might have tried to bribe or enchant your guard while you were trapped in your chamber. Or you might have taken your eating knife and cut your bonds, or simply slipped out of them, for I tied them loosely enough under cover of my cloak, and ridden away to wherever you pleased." Guinevere reached down in surprise to her eating knife, sheathed at her girdle. She had not thought of any of those things. What did that say about her? A braver woman would have fought to survive, but somewhere along the way all the fight had gone out of her. She should have burned and been done with it. Lancelot continued, "It seems to me that you are done running. What you really want is to stop and feel safe." Damn him, the night was right. Yes, she longed to feel safe again, like she had as a little girl in her mother's arms. Before the birds had flown. To never have to worry about someone wanting to kill her. "But we seldom get what we want," Guinevere said. She sat on a log beside the fire and stared into the flames. "Should have burned." "Ah, but it is your lucky day, my queen. It is my sworn duty to protect you and keep you safe." King Artorius had but one regret in his life, that he had not been able to protect Queen Viviana. He made me swear an oath that you would not meet the same fate. Where we are going, Melwis and his mob cannot go. I have in mind a convent, where you may live a quiet life to the end of your days. To reach the convent we must cross my land, and my people are loyal to me, not Melwis. So I trade one prison for another, and you are my jailer. And her crime? To be in the wrong place at the wrong time, to offend the wrong men while the right men saved other damsels. Never her. At least he would let her live. That was something. Lancelot coughed. Actually, I had hoped you might accept the hospitality of my house, before going to the convent. I would offer you the freedom of the grounds, though I would caution you against swimming in the lake. It is quite deep and cold even in the heat of summer. We have a boat, and I'd be happy to take you fishing. Fishing? Of all the things that awaited her at the end of this journey, she had not thought it would include fish. This was all too much. Sir Lancelot, I don't like fishing, he interrupted. It is quite relaxing. Not like hunting at all, though you may do that too, if that is your wish. My house stands in the late king's favorite hunting grounds, and he has not come to thin the numbers much of late. She wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. Or what to say anymore. Lancelot gestured toward some blankets he'd spread out by the fire. Forgive me. You nearly died today, and here I am babbling about deer and fish. I'm sure you need rest. I should have brought the king's pavilion along with a bed suitable for a queen, but in my haste I neglected such necessities. You have my word that tomorrow night you will sleep in the royal bedchamber of my castle, on a feather bed finer than Artorius keeps in the capital. Thank you, Sir Lancelot. She rose and stumbled toward the makeshift bed. She was so numb she did not feel the cold night air nor the hardness of the ground as she drifted off into sleep. 40. Xylander sat in the princess's bedchamber, fighting both sleep and boredom as he waited for her to arrive. Some guard he'd make if he couldn't stay awake. After a while, he decided to steal a little sleep while he waited. She would surely wake him on her return. He stretched out on her bed and lost himself to dreams. Much later he woke to a small warm hand trailing up his thigh. Xurine had spoken of seducing him on their ride here, but he had not expected her to do so before their wedding night. Curious to see what she would do, he lay still, trying to keep his breathing even as if he still slept. She slid his tunic up to his waist, before he felt the mattress sink beneath her weight. Her knee slid between his, pushing his legs apart before her hand crept higher. He should put a stop to this, Xylander told himself. They'd marry in a matter of days, so there was hardly any time to wait. Then again, with their wedding night only days away, no one would know if they'd decided to do a little lovemaking before the wedding. A hand landed over Xylander's mouth. Bigger, heavier than Xurine's. You can scream all you like when I'm inside you, slut, but it'll be too late by then. You'll be mine, not some prince's property. And you will be my wife. That was definitely a man's voice. Which meant it was a man in bed with him, caressing his leg. Xylander reached for his dagger, slashing it across the hand on his thigh. A high scream rose from the man. Xylander threw himself out of bed and seized his sword. He whirled with the blade just as the man fell forward. The blade met flesh. The man grunted softly, then collapsed. Xylander hurried to rekindle the fire, thrusting a torch into the flames so that he might see who his attacker was. The man lay face down on the flagstones, blood spreading in a pool beneath him. Xylander used a foot to flip him over. He recognized Lord Melwis, but the man's dead eyes did not recognize him. Xylander glanced at the man's hands, but neither had any blood on them. The cut along the man's throat was clearly what had killed him, but blood blossomed on the man's tunic, as if Xylander had struck him a gut wound too. No. He hadn't stabbed the man in the belly. Sure, it had been dark, but... Xylander glanced at the bed. A dark pool of blood marked the sheets, and in the middle of it sat what appeared to be a small sausage. Realization dawned, followed by horror. Xylander wrapped his hand in the sheet, seized the man's severed appendage, and threw it into the fire. He headed for the table and poured himself a large cup of wine. He downed it in 2 gulps, shaking his head at the sheer insanity of it all. Then he took a deep breath. "Guards," he bellowed. He didn't recognize the 2 men who came running into the room, but he wasn't sure even his brother Lubos would believe him if he told the tale of what had happened. "That's Lord Regent Melwis," one of the guards gasped. "What happened to him?" the other asked. "I believe he came here intending to attack Princess Xylander. However, he found me instead, and I do not deal lightly with assassins," Xylander said. He threw another log on the fire to cover the man's flaming cock before they saw it. One of the guards coughed. "Who are you, sir?" He didn't look like he wanted to issue the challenge, but with the grim determination of a man who knew his duty, he'd done it anyway. "Good man." Xylander would need to know his name for sure. "I'm Prince Xylander, betrothed to Princess Xylander." Oh, he hated this bit, but for Xylander, he would do it. "Once we're married and crowned, I will be your new king." The 2 guards looked at one another, before going down on one knee. "Your Majesty." A pause before the one who'd challenged him ventured, "What would you like us to do with the body, sire?" Xylander gave it a look of deep disgust. "Take it away before the princess sees it. There has been enough blood and death. I'd heard this was a peaceful, prosperous kingdom. But from what I've seen lately..." The brave man managed a smile. "King Artorius was a great king, sire, before he fell ill. A good king and queen can build us back up to where we were, right, sire?" Xylander managed a regal smile, the likes of which his brother Lubos might have been proud. "Of course." 41. Are you fond of hunting, Your Majesty? Guinevere looked up from her food to find Lancelot's eyes on her. What had he asked? Something about hunting. She shook her head. Hunting was my brother's passion, not mine. I had a whole castle to see to, with little time for trips into the forest around our home. Besides, the only weapon I know how to wield is a knife, and there is very little honor in slaying something small and feeble enough to fall beneath the blade of my eating knife. She brandished her knife, plunged it into a piece of turnip, and popped it into her mouth. Lancelot laid his own eating knife on the table. I have seen men slain in battle with a blade no bigger than this. Skilled assassins can kill with blades far smaller and sharper. Why, if you had been of a mind to, you could have used your eating knife to slay any one of your guards, while they lay in an enchanted sleep of your making, so that you might escape from your chamber in Castrum Castle. She could not suppress a shudder. If you suspected such things, you should have taken it from me. The man who falls asleep at his post deserves to die. Such is the way of war. I fear I have not the heart for war. Nor the stomach for it, either. Guinevere pushed her plate away, sickened at the thought of killing a man simply because he slept. You need not fear anything here, Your Majesty. We are so far from any of our borders that by the time an enemy came near, he would have to lay waste to half the country. By the time he arrived here, I would see you safe within the walls of Castrum. Where the people of Castrum probably still wanted to burn her alive. Guinevere managed a watery smile as she rose. Thank you, I fear I am unwell. She closed her eyes as she fought the terror of that night, stumbling blindly away. A warm hand engulfed hers. Please, Your Majesty. Forgive me. I meant to reassure you, truly. I am a knight, not a courtier, and I have little experience with fine ladies. Guinevere opened her eyes. He looked so earnest. I am not a courtier either, she said softly. Luckily, I wasn't queen long enough for anyone to find out. Lancelot swiped a hand across his face. I fear I have only made things worse. To remind you of your recent loss, I meant to distract you, perhaps amuse you by taking you hunting, but if you have no stomach for blood, I cannot imagine even falconry. She stiffened. You have hunting falcons? The finest in the kingdom, your majesty. King Artorius brought his best birds here, and they bred true. She hadn't flown a falcon since the day her mother died. Her voice came out breathless with longing. Show me. 42. He'd been about to suggest that it was time she entered the convent, for Lancelot had all but given up on seeing any sign of the vivacity Guinevere had shown before Artorius's illness. For 2 weeks he'd watched her as she sat at his table, fading as surely as she'd done while imprisoned in Castrum Castle. Almost as if a part of her had died with her husband. Was it because she was a woman that she mourned so deeply for a man she'd barely known? Lancelot had known Artorius all his life and missed him as keenly as any dutiful son would his beloved father, but he had not let his sorrow stop him from doing what was necessary. More than anything, he felt driven to action, to do the things Artorius would have encouraged him to do, for death's shadow lay upon them all. She pushed her food listlessly about her plate, as if it no longer interested her. Not that the stewed mutton had been anything to tempt the appetite of a queen. She needed something to enervate her blood, meat from a swifter creature than an aging sheep. Venison perhaps, or fresh pork from a wild boar. Perhaps the hunt would do her good. Yet she shot down that suggestion as swiftly as a sleeping swan on a frozen lake. The convent it must be then. The holy women there might be able to help her, for heaven knew he could not. You have hunting falcons? Had he mentioned the birds? He'd been rambling, trying to find the words to suggest she go to the convent, but he forgot it all in the spark of light in her eye. The first he'd seen in far too long. He drew himself up with pride. The finest in the kingdom, your majesty. King Artorius brought his best birds here, and they bred true. Though it had been a long time since the king had had the time to fly his birds, and now he never would. The spark in her eyes kindled into flame. Show me. Lancelot offered her his arm, a gesture he'd repeated 100 times since he'd brought her to his home. But this time, the way her fingers tightened around his bicep was different. Like one of his falcons closing her talons on prey. Yet no prey had ever been so willing to be captured as himself at that moment. Have the falconer bring the birds out by the lake, Lancelot ordered, not wanting to expose Guinevere to the mess in the mews. His castellan had died during the summer, and he'd been too busy in Castrum to come home to appoint a new one. He would need to remedy that soon, or risk not having enough stores to last the winter. Perhaps he should take Guinevere around the long way to the lake, to give the falconer time to find perches for the birds. Your apple trees have a bountiful crop this year. Your blackberry hedges are doing well too. I imagine your alewife will be very busy over the coming weeks. Guinevere reached up and plucked an apple. She bit into it, closing her eyes. Ripe already and sweeter than I expected. I'm surprised your men have not harvested these yet. Or is the grain harvest late this year? A queen who knew about agriculture? He'd thought ladies knew less about farming than he did. I would have to ask my men. My castellan would know. Or he would, were he not buried in the churchyard. Did he even have an alewife? He ducked his head. Forgive me, my queen. I should know more about my estate than I do, but my castellan has taken care of this estate since before the king gave it to me, and he died recently. Alas, he did not impart any of his vast knowledge to me before death claimed him. Her lips lifted in a tiny smile. My mother told me most men do not look further than their next meal, and then only notice if it is missing. Those who have the most notice the least. Too busy waging war and playing at politics, tilting at tourneys or clashing swords. Women are the ones who make the world work. Stunned, he stared at her. He'd never heard her speak so openly before. His mouth was dry as he tried to work out how to respond to such a strongly worded statement without offending her. Finally he settled for, "Without women, none of us would be here. I understand men also have a part to play in the begetting of children." She patted his arm. "Rest easy, Sir Lancelot, for the world needs men too." He couldn't help it. He burst out laughing, then stopped, anxious not to offend her. Her eyes danced as a wry smile touched her lips. "Are knights forbidden to laugh?" He sobered. "No, but offending the Queen is frowned upon." Another pat. "I think I'd be more offended if you do not laugh at my jokes, Sir Lancelot. Or perhaps it has simply been so long since I told one that they are no longer funny. If they ever were." He longed to reassure her, but anything he said would be a lie. He wasn't even sure why he'd laughed, for her words hadn't been that funny. Perhaps it had been her tone. Deep in thought, he walked beside her in silence to the lakeshore where the falcons sat, hooded and hunched on their perches. One perch stood empty. The beating of great wings heralded the falconer's return with King Artorius's favorite bird. "She's magnificent," Guinevere breathed, approaching the golden eagle without a hint of fear. She accepted a glove from a servant, and slipped it on with all the familiarity of a skilled falconer. Then she held out her arm for the king's bird. Lancelot held his breath as the eagle stepped from the falconer's glove to hers. Artorius had rarely flown the bird himself, complaining that the eagle was heavier than his sword. Yet Guinevere did not lower her arm. Instead she lifted it, launching the bird into flight. "Magnificent," she repeated, watching the bird soar out over the lake. In his cups, King Artorius would often say that Sir Gawain was the most lethal of all his knights, Lancelot said. "More kills than the rest of us put together." When Guinevere laughed, it was like the first spring sunshine after a winter of dark nights. "The bird is a knight?" Lancelot's heart swelled in his chest. This was the beautiful woman who'd stolen his very breath in the king's court. More magnificent than any eagle. King Artorius held a tourney here to celebrate Xylander's 16th name day a few years ago. Many knights came in the hope of winning a favor or token from the princess, including one who called himself the Green Knight. He was greener than I, as it turned out, getting his helm bashed in by a stray lance early on. He continued to ride, but in the next round, instead of aiming for his opponent, he headed for the king. He found Guinevere's eyes on him instead of the eagle now and hurried to continue. The falconer was bringing out the birds for some hunting after the tourney, and Gawain managed to get loose. Instead of flying away though, the bird headed for the Green Knight. She'd seen her own reflection in the knight's helm and sought to do battle with the bird in her territory, I believe. Guinevere gestured for him to continue. Gawain fastened her claws around the helm and pulled it off the knight's head. Now able to see, the knight veered away from the king. Thus the bird saved him from the Green Knight's lance. At the end of the tournament, before the champion was announced, the king knighted the bird for saving his life. She laughed merrily. I had heard many tales about King Artorius and his knights, but never that one of them was a female bird. Gawain returned, her talons clenched around a bundle of brown fur that turned out to be a fat rabbit, which she dropped at Guinevere's feet. Ignoring the falconer's outstretched arm, the bird returned to Guinevere's glove, and the falconer hurried forward to feed the bird. Good girl, Sir Gawain, Guinevere crooned, stroking the bird's breast with her ungloved fingers while the bird's beak was busy. Then, as if some signal passed between queen and eagle, she lifted her arm to let the bird soar once more. I prefer duck to rabbit, she called after the bird. Lancelot wished Artorius were here, to see the two together. The king would have lost his heart to the girl, as he himself already had. For a girl who claimed she didn't hunt, she flew a falcon far too well for Lancelot's liking. Where did you learn to fly an eagle like that? Guinevere shrugged. My mother was fond of her falcons. Ever since I was a little girl, I remember watching her fly them. She promised me that on my 14th name day I might learn to fly them too, but when that day came, she'd entered her confinement. Yet when I went to see my mother that morning, she refused to lie abed. Her feet had swollen so that her boots did not fit, and her belly was so round I feared it would pop, but she meant to keep her promise, so she'd ordered the birds brought into the garden. All day we stayed there while she taught me everything she knew about hawking. It was wonderful. Yet she'd left her mother behind to come to Castrum. You must miss her, Lancelot said. Her eyes fixed on the wheeling eagle. Every day. Perhaps if she hadn't gone hawking that day, or if she hadn't fallen, to this day I still don't know why she fell. The ground was flat and even, yet she was suddenly on the ground in a dead faint, one side of her face sagging just like Artorius's that morning after the wedding. She wiped her eyes. Realization dawned. Apoplexy. You knew. Yes. She sighed and stared at her feet. Mother died some hours later and the baby with her. I knew it was only a matter of time before the same happened to the king. When Mother died, Father blamed the birds. He went mad in the mews, taking an axe to perchers and birds alike. I tried to stop him, but his madness must have clouded his vision. He struck me and I hit my head when I fell. When I awoke, all the falcons had flown away. He would allow no birds in the castle after that, ordering them shot on sight. Mother had always loved them so, and to lose them so soon after losing her. After Mother died, I became the castle chatelaine and was too busy to have much time for anything. In Castrum there was Lady Ragnar to run the place while I had no place. Tears trickled down her cheeks. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her as she wept. You have a place here, for as long as you wish. Forever, if he had his way. Even as her tears soaked through his tunic, he'd never been happier, his heart soaring up there with her eagle. Guinevere lifted her head. Thank you. Every day I spend here, I find myself more reluctant to go to the convent you said you would send me to. Nor would they allow me a falcon, let alone an eagle as magnificent as Sir Gawain. Then stay here instead. Until I choose a new castellan, I will name you Castle Chatelaine, and you may order the estate as you wish. Including Gawain. His mouth was suddenly dry. For as long as you desire. There was longing in her eyes as she looked at him. He did not make the mistake of imagining it was for him. More likely it was his estate, or the eagle. And what happens when someone comes from Castrum, to make sure the traitor queen is safely imprisoned in a convent, where she can no longer harm the kingdom, and they find me ruling your household instead, as free as a bird? Then I will honor my king's final command, and protect you with my life. Guinevere shook her head. Artorius would not have wanted you to die for me. You are still young, and with this fine estate, you should find a wife, have children. Lancelot managed a smile. There is but one woman I want for my wife, and I fear she stands so high above me, I dare not ask for her hand. Now he could not meet her eyes, or she would know. You're in love with Princess Xylander? What? Of course not. He stared at her. She relaxed. Then I see no impediment. As the leader of the king's knights, you are second only to the king himself. Merely ask the woman. No woman in this kingdom with any sense would refuse you. Lancelot wet his lips. She is a widow still in mourning. Surely she would guess. She drew in a sharp breath. You fell in love with another man's wife? I can't believe your high honor would allow such a thing. And yet, if you did not pursue her, yes, perhaps I can see that. You have hidden depths, Sir Lancelot. Few men would resist a lady like you have. But now, if her husband is dead, you have only to wait until she is done mourning, and there is nothing to stop you from marrying her. Unless she knows nothing of your love. Lancelot bowed his head, not daring to speak, for he knew not what he might say. Right, Guinevere said brusquely. Then you have her mourning period to make your intentions known. She will be your wife before the year is out, and I will retire to the convent, for a new wife will not want another woman around, running her household. Lancelot's heart sank. How had she misunderstood so completely? My queen, he began, not sure how to continue. Guinevere waved her hand. You have been kindness itself, Sir Lancelot. It would be cruel indeed to stand in the way of your happiness, and for all my sins, cruelty is not one of them. Merely say the word, and I shall yield to your wife as readily as she must yield to you. She lifted her arm as the eagle returned, carrying a particularly plump duck. Guinevere was too busy praising the bird and dealing with her gift to have any attention for Lancelot, or the proposal that lingered on his lips. Better that he never ask, for to have her in his household, to see her every day would be enough. He daren't risk losing her. The lady he loved, who would never love him in return. To be near her was enough. 43. Guinevere was true to her word, giving orders to the household for all the world like it was her own. At first she'd seen nervous glances directed toward Lancelot, before some of his bolder servants had summoned the courage to whisper their questions in his ear, their eyes fixed fearfully on the woman they'd surely heard was the traitor queen. Lancelot nodded gravely at their concerns, but after the third such report, he held up his hands. Queen Guinevere honors me with her care for my household. Without a castellan, we might not have stores for the winter. Out of the kindness of her heart, while she remains with us, she has offered to act as chatelaine to my humble estate. She has commanded royal castles, the staff of kings, including, 'tis said, the kings themselves. I am a fighting man. I know more of swords and arrows than turnips and preserves. Know that if she tells me to dig turnips, I will gladly pick up a shovel in her service. She is our queen, and we are all honor-bound to obey her orders. Including me. There was some laughter at this, but it quickly faded into silence. A round of nods passed across the hall, and Lancelot's people got to work. Trees and bushes became stripped of their fruit, and Guinevere herself moving between the smokehouse, alehouse and kitchens, supervising staff who needed little guidance once they knew what was wanted. She even had time to hunt in the afternoons, which became a regular occurrence when the cook ventured that she would make duck confit from Sir Gawain's catch. The eagle was as fond of duck as Guinevere, it seemed, and would happily bring her mistress 3 or 4 a day. When the lids on the first casks of berry wine were nailed shut, Guinevere ventured into the cellars to take stock of what stores Lancelot already had. There was time to brew another batch or 2 of ale, and Lancelot's men wanted to send out a hunting party to bring back some deer before the first snows fell, as Lancelot was apparently particularly fond of smoked venison. She sent the hunters out happily. By the time they returned, the smokehouse would be finished with the last of the hams. Lancelot's wine cellar, however, was one place she hadn't been. She descended the steps into the dusty cellar, wondering what Artorius would have thought of her venturing into such a dirty place. He certainly had never envisioned it, if the white gowns he'd given her were any indication. She hadn't worn any of her queenly attire since she'd arrived, preferring the gowns she'd brought from home. She'd need some warmer ones before winter came, and perhaps a new cloak too. She'd speak to Lancelot's weavers in the afternoon, before hunting. She'd already met the seamstress who made Lancelot's beautiful surcoats. The girl's eyes had gleamed at the prospect of creating clothes for a queen, albeit a dowager one. When she reached the bottom of the steps, Guinevere held her lantern high. Its light did not reach the far wall of the cavernous cellar. For a man who drank sparingly, there seemed to be an awfully large number of wine barrels here. Back home, she'd have kept a tally on the wall by the stairs to keep track of the cellar contents. She surveyed the walls until she found what she wanted, faint charcoal markings that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. That would change. She enlisted a pair of maids to dust the barrels so she could see their markings, tallying them up on a fresh patch of wall. The numbers matched for some of the vintages, but others had not been recorded at all. A particularly large collection of dust-caked barrels at the back, which all bore the same markings, a ring of what might be mountains or teeth, surrounding a smaller circle, had not been included in the tally. She estimated half the barrels in the cellar were stamped with this mark. None of the maids, the alewife or the cook seemed to know what it meant, so she decided to ask Lancelot at dinner. Yet when she entered the great hall, Lancelot leaped to his feet, incensed. "What happened?" he demanded. She stared at him blankly, then glanced down to make sure she hadn't torn her gown on a bramble bush again, like she had earlier in the week. Combined with a particularly dark berry juice stain, she had to admit, it had appeared rather gory to someone who hadn't known she'd been picking berries all day. Today, however, her gown was unharmed, but for a cobweb caught on her hem. She brushed it away with her foot. "Nothing to be concerned about," she said finally. Lancelot shook his head, then pointed at her cheek. "But your face. Tell me who struck you. This will not go unpunished." She lifted a startled hand to her cheek, and it came away black. Guinevere felt her cheeks redden. "Forgive me. I was so caught up in my counting that I forgot to wash. I shall deal with it directly." "Allow me." Lancelot beckoned to a servant, who brought forward a bowl of water and a cloth. He stroked the wet cloth across her face, his eyes so intent on his work that she did not dare lift her gaze to meet his, or she would blush even brighter. Instead, she traced the spiky circle on the table with her dirty finger. "Do you know what this means?" she asked, taking the cloth from him so that she might clean the charcoal off her fingers. Lancelot glanced at the table. "That's the mark of the kingdom of Moravia. Ringed by mountains, they make the finest berry wine in the world. So fine, only kings can afford to drink it. King Artorius shared a cup with me once, on the day he granted me my knighthood. It's a heady brew, sweet but potent. The barrels were locked in a special storeroom in the king's cellar. Only Lady Ragnar had the key, and she guards it closely. They were part of the king's mother's dowry, I believe. She came from Moravia, along with Lady Ragnar's mother." Guinevere sat down. "Well, there are more than 100 barrels bearing that mark in your cellar, covered in dust. Maybe more, depending on what's under all that dust. We couldn't reach all the barrels to read the markings beyond the first row." Lancelot gaped. "In my cellar? A barrel of that is worth more than my whole estate. It's been a decade since anyone's been able to buy Moravian berry wine, and it was not cheap to start with. And there's 100, you say?" Guinevere nodded. He paled. "You've just made me the richest man in the country. Nay, maybe the whole world. Marry me, my queen, for I'd be a fool to let you go." He sounded so serious, but Guinevere knew it had to be a jest. She forced herself to laugh. "I only discovered riches you already possessed, Sir Lancelot. Hardly grounds enough for you to want an unwashed widow like me." He opened his mouth as if to respond, yet he said nothing. Then a servant brought dinner, and the conversation quickly turned to duck, wine and venison, and which would be wanted for supper today and on the morrow. More than once, she felt Lancelot's eyes upon her, assessing her as surely as she'd taken stock of the contents of his cellars. Had it been anyone else, she might have turned away from such scrutiny, but she had few secrets left from Lancelot, and those were not worth knowing anyway. "Will you hunt this afternoon?" Lancelot asked. Tempting though it was, she knew it was wiser to refuse. "I had hoped to, but I would prefer to finish my work in your cellars first. If I had known there would be so much already stored, perhaps I would not have ordered another wagon of mead from the convent. As it is, shifting so much so that I might see the markings may take me until nightfall. Or into next week. I'll put more men at your disposal. I'd hoped to ask you to train the new falcons with me today, for the falconer tells me they are ready to start hunting. The birds can wait until the morrow, I am sure, but no later. I am conscious that your kindness is far more than I deserve." I promised that I would take care of you, yet here you are, working so hard to ready my estate for winter. King Artorius would tell me I am derelict in my duty, and I fear our late king might be right." Guinevere shrugged. "It amuses me to be useful. In Castrum there was little for me to do, even when I was not imprisoned in my room. Here I have the freedom of your house, the grounds your cellars, and the use of your falcons. Here I am happy." As the words left her lips, she recognized them as truth. Unadorned, unexpected, yet so surprisingly accurate, the thought silenced her for a moment. Lancelot caught her hand and kissed it. A tingle ran up her arm, just as it had on her wedding night. "You honor me, my queen. I only wish your late husband had lived long enough to see you happy." She sighed. Yes, she wished he'd lived longer too. Always, Artorius came between them, a gulf that could not be bridged. "I'd best go finish counting your wine barrels. You might have another 100 barrels of Moravian wine, or enough vinegar to pickle 10 years' worth of cabbage." She dropped a small curtsy. "I thank you for your hospitality, Sir Lancelot. I shall see you at supper." 44. Xylander smothered what had to be his 10th yawn. It wasn't that listening to endless petitions from his subject was boring, but he'd scarcely slept more than half the night since he'd married Xylander. She had insisted that a queen's primary duty was to produce heirs, and that meant he'd have to bed her 2 or even 3 times a night. It was hardly a hardship. One look at her body stirred his desire, and her look of wide-eyed wonder every time she squealed with pleasure at his touch made him feel like the most skillful lover that ever lived. But a man needed sleep too, or all the petitions ran together in his head, and he'd find himself nodding off in the middle of hearing day. He'd wager Artorius had never fallen asleep on his throne. Xylander pronounced judgment on the case, something about borders shifting as a river moved its course between the spring floods and the summer drought, and the 2 men left, seemingly satisfied. Instead of calling another petitioner, a knight approached the dais. Xylander really did have to learn everyone's names. He knew every man he'd ever hunted with, so it shouldn't be too hard to remember the names of his new court. "Sire, would you like me to call an end to the audience so that you may retire early today?" the knight asked. The knight had seen him struggling to stay awake then, though he was too well-bred to let even a whisper of his disapproval slip into his tone. Yes, but Xylander would only see that as an excuse to take him to bed even earlier. Xylander heartily wished that he could split himself in 2, one to bed Xylander whenever she demanded it, one to do all the kingly duties that came with the crown that weighed heavily on his head, though he had not worn the thing today, and perhaps even a 3rd copy to sleep, go hunting and do all the things he'd normally filled his time with before becoming king of Castrum. "So?" "No, sir." Xylander racked his brain for the man's name. "Dagonet," the knight supplied. "Thank you, Sir Dagonet, but no. These good people have waited many days, through Artorius's illness and our coronation, to have their grievances aired. The audience will continue until sunset, as I have promised." Xylander would show them that he might not be as good and wise a king as Artorius, but he would at least keep his word. "Perhaps a restorative from the kitchens might help you, sire?" At Xylander's eager nod, Sir Dagonet gestured for a servant to see to it. The next petitioner was called, a messenger from the King of Flamand. Xylander's belly curled in dread. The last messenger had brought another man's severed head, a declaration of war from his father, for the head had once been attached to the shoulders of one of the King of Castrum's messengers. The messenger bowed low. "Your Majesty, I bring greetings from the King of Flamand." Xylander squinted at the man. "Nuncio. When did you become a messenger?" The last time he'd seen Nunzio, the man had been one of his father's guard captains. The bastard-born son of one of father's barons, he'd been considered noble enough to command men, but not quite noble enough to attend court. He'd greeted Xylander at the gates more than once, when his successful hunting parties had returned to the city. Nunzio lifted his head and stared. "Prince Xylander? What are you doing here?" Sir Dagonet made a noise of disapproval. "You might be a foreigner here, messenger of Flamand, but His Majesty, King Xylander, still deserves your courtesy as long as you are permitted in his court." Nunzio blinked. He always had been a quick thinker. "Forgive me, King Xylander. I bring greetings from King Lubos of Flamand. He is anxious to re-establish ties of friendship between our two nations. He seeks his sister, Princess Guinevere, who he believes his father may have sent here. As King Ludgar lost his mind to madness in the end, he confided in no one in the days leading up to his death. King Lubos holds out hope that she might be found in Castrum, and he wishes to welcome her home to Flamand." So Lubos didn't know about the marriage, or Artorius's death. Or that Guinevere had been crowned as Castrum's queen. Xylander wished he could be the one to tell the news to his brother, just to see his face. But they were both kings now, and he had no place in Flamand, just as Lubos had no place in Castrum. Guinevere. Xylander hadn't forgotten about her, but he'd been so busy, he hadn't had a chance to find out what had become of her. Some knight named Lancelot had taken her to a safe place outside the city, was all he'd heard. The little he knew of Lancelot was enough for Xylander to be sure Guinevere was in good hands, for the man's honor was equal to his skills in swordsmanship. But Xylander should have sent someone to check on her to make sure. He could send someone now and set his conscience at ease. That's what kings did, let other men do their bidding. Yet, Xylander had not left the castle in weeks. "How far away are Lancelot's lands?" Xylander asked Dagonet. Sir Dagonet shrugged. 2 days' ride. Maybe less, if the rider is swift and does not stop to rest. Xylander nodded. "Find Captain Nunzio somewhere to sleep in the castle. He shall have his answer in a week." A week would be enough. Time to find out what had happened to Guinevere, and to decide what to tell Lubos about all the events in Castrum. 45. One of the new pages came tumbling down the hill. He righted himself for a moment before falling to his knees before Lancelot, his eyes wide with panic. "Sir, it's the king." Lancelot struggled to remember the boy's name. All 3 new pages were orphans, and if he didn't remember their names, who would? Surely Artorius had never forgotten his name. He would need to make more of an effort, if he aspired to be as good a foster father as the king had been to him. "Slow down, boy, and tell me your name," Lancelot said. The boy obediently took a few deep breaths. "I'm Galahad, sir. My mother was Lady Elaine, and—" The bastard boy, Lancelot recalled. Lady Elaine had died in childbed, never revealing the name of the boy's father. Now he'd taken the boy into his household, there would be whispers that he was the father, but he'd never lain with Lady Elaine. Or any of the women at court. He'd hoped one day he might take a wife, but now... Lancelot tore his eyes away from Guinevere, crooning to her new falcon. "Right. Galahad. Tell me what has happened to the king." The boy's eyes widened even more. "He wants to know where Queen Guinevere is." Lancelot's heart sank. He'd known this day would come, but he'd hoped to have longer before it did. The new king had consolidated his hold on the court quickly, if he had time to send someone after Guinevere already. "See that the king's messenger is offered refreshment in the great hall, and I shall be with him shortly," Lancelot said. He hurried up to the house, praying that the messenger was someone he knew. A man who would trust his word, and head back to the capital while Lancelot worked out what to do. "What is it?" Guinevere called. "A messenger for me, nothing more," Lancelot called back. "I shall deal with him and return directly." If he asked her to run and hide, would she do it? It might be the only way to save her. Artorius might have listened, been willing to weigh the woman's case before making a judgment, but this new king, Lancelot, knew too little of him, and he'd heard very little from court. A man new to kingship might be swayed by his advisers or Melwis. Lancelot stepped into the hall, taking a moment for his eyes to adjust before he approached the messenger, who had a cup of wine in his hand already, and a jug at his elbow. "Sir Lancelot," the man said. A man Lancelot did not know. Some new servant of the king's, no doubt. Lancelot inclined his head politely. "You have me at a disadvantage, sir, for I fear we have not met. Yet my servants tell me you bring word from the king." The man set his cup on the table. Now Lancelot could see his clothes were dusty from the journey. He had been in too much of a hurry to bathe or rest along the way. The king must want Guinevere most urgently. "Not word so much as a quest. I have come in search of Queen Guinevere," the man said. "She's not here," Lancelot said smoothly. "As I told the king, I took her to a convent where she might spend the rest of her days in seclusion. I shall send a servant to fetch her, though it might be some days before." "Xylander." Guinevere's voice startled them both, as her quiet feet carried her into the hall. "What in heaven's name are you doing here?" Lancelot's heart dropped into his boots as he sank to one knee. "Your Majesty," he murmured. What kind of king rode around the countryside alone, giving his vassals no warning of his approach? The man must be mad. "King Lubos sent word that he wishes to welcome you back home, and demands your safe return," King Xylander said. "You can't send her back," Lancelot blurted out, jumping to his feet, before he remembered to add, "Your Majesty." The new king's gaze was as piercing as it was unsettling. "And why not?" "Because King Artorius had made Lancelot swear to protect her, and keep her from her family. His last command." Lancelot swallowed. He saw no mercy in those cold eyes that he might appeal to. Then inspiration struck. "Because she is my wife," he said. "What God has joined no man, even a king, may sunder." "Your wife?" King Xylander exclaimed. "But the Dowager Queen is still in mourning for her husband. She cannot possibly have remarried." How could Lancelot have forgotten? In desperation he said, "Her marriage with the king was not valid, as it was never consummated. A mistake I did not make, I assure you, for she was still a maid when I took her." He glanced over his shoulder to find Guinevere staring at him, stricken. He only prayed that she stayed speechless long enough not to contradict the story. "As her husband, I will ensure she has no further opportunities to commit treason, and that is why I have kept her here, away from the temptation of court. And here she will remain as long as she lives," Lancelot continued. He didn't dare turn to meet her eyes. He prayed she would accept his apology and his explanation after the king had gone. "And what has the lady to say to this?" the king demanded. Now he heard her soft footsteps approaching, before Guinevere tucked her hand into the crook of Lancelot's arm. He half expected her to dig her nails in as deeply as an eagle's talons, yet she did not. "I like it here, and I intend to stay," she said. "With Sir Lancelot, of course." Lancelot's jaw dropped. He closed his mouth as quickly as he could, knowing he would be too late, only to find the king's mouth hung open as he stared at Guinevere. "Sir Lancelot and his falconer have been training 3 new hawks, and I hope to hunt with them before long. He has promised me one for my own, and I believe I shall call her Circe." The king grinned. "Hunting falcons? I should like to see the muse." "Perhaps Sir Lancelot can arrange a hunting party for you and your new queen when the new birds are trained," Guinevere continued. She beckoned to a servant. "Have chambers and a bath prepared for the king." To Lancelot's relief, the maid hurried off to obey, without so much as a questioning look to himself. As if Guinevere truly was the mistress of this castle, as his lady wife. "Alas, I cannot stay for more than a night. I must return to the capital in the morning." But perhaps in the summer a hunting party. Xylander nodded, looking eager. Lancelot nodded with him, trying to hide his dread. As your majesty wishes, of course. The king poured himself another cup of wine and peppered Lancelot with questions about the hunting hereabouts, which Lancelot was all too happy to answer. This was King Artorius's favorite hunting grounds, and Lancelot had taken great care to ensure his lands remained exactly as Artorius had liked them. Finally, a servant came to escort the king to his chamber. Only when Xylander had vanished from sight did Lancelot bury his head in his hands. This was a disaster. He could not imagine anything worse. A light hand touched his elbow. If you value your head, you'll come with me to the lake, where no one will hear us. Now. Lancelot lifted his head to meet Guinevere's unforgiving gaze. Things were indeed worse. 46. As she led the way to the lake, Guinevere debated what to say first. Yet it was Lancelot who broke the silence. What possessed you to invite the king hunting? He hissed. Guinevere folded her arms across her breasts. A more benevolent spirit than the one who inspired you to lie to him, she returned hotly. I'd thought you a man of honor, yet you seem happy to tell blatant lies to your king. My king died in his bed before we left the capital, and I never lied to him in my life, Lancelot declared. That man might be his replacement, but he is not yet my king. I have sworn no oaths, pledged no allegiance. Xylander is not a fool. It is only a matter of time until he realizes that of all his vassals, you have not renewed your oath to the crown. He will summon you to court, and what will you do then? Thoughts of Lancelot refusing to bow to the king and having his head lopped from his shoulders sent her heart stuttering in her chest. If his summons is for me alone, and he is worthy to wear that crown, then I will swear any oath he asks, Lancelot said. As long as he leaves you alone. Which is why I cannot believe you invited the man hunting. Here. Where you are hiding from the court. And drawing attention to yourself, appearing in the hall and addressing him directly, without his title. I asked you to wait outside where he might not see you. Why, it is almost as if you wish to be tried for treason. Xylander would as soon cut off his own hand as try her for treason, as Guinevere well knew. He had risked his life to whisk her out of her father's kingdom to here. Was it possible that Lancelot did not know who Xylander was? Then again, perhaps Xylander was the one who had kept their relationship quiet, not wishing to alert his new people that his sister was the woman they'd tried to burn for treason. No more than you. Why did you tell him we were married? She demanded. I thought you lusted after some highborn widow, waiting only until her husband's bed was cold enough before sliding between her thighs. Do you plan to take her as your mistress, as you cannot have two wives? Or will you lie to her too? Lancelot stiffened as if she'd slapped him. No man of honor would dare come between a man and his wife. A man's family is his concern. And I would be faithful to you as your devoted husband. There will never be anyone else for me, even if our marriage is a lie. I said what I did to protect you. So Lancelot truly did not know. But Xylander is my brother. Marriage to me would make you his brother-in-law. A man who will never be far from his thoughts, because Xylander will worry that I am unhappy. As she would be, trapped in a loveless marriage. But hadn't he just said, your brother? Your brother is the new king? Lancelot dropped to his knees. My queen, I beg your forgiveness. I did not know. I will go to the king and confess everything. Perhaps he will do me the favor of granting me a quick death, if you would intercede on my behalf. I cannot ask for more. He half rose and Guinevere yanked him back down, landing in the mud beside him. Don't be a fool. You can't go off without giving me answers. I deserve that much. Lancelot turned anguished eyes to her. Of course, my queen. What do you wish to know? The words didn't want to come out, but she forced them out. My wedding night. How did you know? He reddened. Perhaps you do not remember, but I stood guard outside your door that night. And I listened. He'd listened to the king reject her and then start snoring. While she'd had her eyes closed, thinking of Lancelot. Guinevere's cheeks warmed, and she remembered Lancelot staring at her before Artorius had closed the door. What did he say to you that night? She asked. He made me swear that if anything ever happened to him, I was to protect you, and not let anyone send you back to where you had come from. It was the last thing he said to me, and I could not disregard his dying wish. Lancelot met her eyes. Even if it costs me my head. No other man had ever been willing to sacrifice his life for her. A sacrifice she did not deserve. She could not let this man die to protect her. Xylander needed good men like Lancelot. If only she could spend the rest of her life with such a man, but his loyalty to his king came first, while a wife would always be a distant second. I absolve you of your oath. I will return to my father's kingdom willingly, and I'll tell my brother in the morning. Guinevere managed a smile. My father is no longer king if my other brother, Lubos, has taken the throne. He undoubtedly wishes to betroth me to someone, in order to rebuild the alliances my father destroyed in his madness. Some old man, who wants an obedient young wife to give him heirs of royal blood. Or maybe just one who will keep his castle for him, and help to raise his existing children. Her heart constricted at the thought, but she knew it was pointless to resist. She was born a princess, a political pawn to be sacrificed for the good of the crown. If only Lancelot truly had married her. Only then could she stay. Lancelot shook his head. I swore to protect you with my last breath, and I shall. Even if it is from yourself and your own brother. I will challenge him for you, for he will not take you from here while I draw breath. So I swore to my king, and I will not be forsworn. Stupid, honorable fool. What man would rather die than break his oath? It would break her heart to leave him, but it would grieve her even more to lose him. Heaven help her, but she was in love with the man. Marry me. The words left her lips before she could consider them, and yet, she did not wish to call them back. Marry me in truth and live. Desire flared in his eyes, hot enough to melt iron. Yet a moment later, it was gone, as if it had never been. My queen, I am not worthy. My king chose you as his bride, and I am merely a knight, risen in his service. How could I bring myself to sully the purity he made me promise to preserve? She'd been the widow he wanted. How had she not guessed until now? Now that it was too late. Unless... Inspiration struck. But I'm not your queen. I never truly was. The marriage wasn't consummated, remember? I am a maiden still. She swallowed. When I lay in the bed beside Artorius, fearful of my wedding night, I closed my eyes and thought of you. He stared at her. Me? Why in heaven's name would you do that? Her cheeks burned. I thought, if it had been you instead of him, I could endure it. If I imagined his hands were yours, that it was you touching me inside me, I could bear it, nay, even enjoy my wedding night. Why did she suddenly feel naked, with his eyes on her like that? Truly. Hope kindled in his eyes, then died. But your brothers, kings both of them, would never allow you to marry a lowly knight. Actually, Xylander urged me to consider you instead of Artorius when we first arrived. She willed her cheeks to cool, but they would not. Foolishly, I insisted a king would protect me better from my father's men than his most valued knight. I was wrong. She wet her lips. Marry me, and I will tell my brother all you have done to protect me, out of loyalty to your king. I will keep your castle, be your chatelaine, while you continue to serve your king. Xylander needs good men, and you are the best. Hope rose a third time, and this time it stayed. And what would you ask in return for all this? Me? You offer me much, and even more to your brother. What is your price for all of this? Guinevere laughed shakily. A princess is without price. I am a pawn, a prize, someone to be handed over to the winner in a game of politics. I don't get to ask or to answer. My fate is to submit, to offer my body in service to whoever my brothers or my father deem worthy. Tears sprang to her eyes and she wiped them away. I am a woman and my fate will be the same, whether I am a shepherd's wife or a queen. For my husband I must lie back, spread my legs and bear his babies. Until it kills me. She wept freely now, remembering her mother, whose bed was barely cold before her father had popped a new wife into it. Lancelot's arms encircled her, protective as always, as he pressed her face against his chest. Gentle hands stroked her hair as she only cried harder, wishing she could stop. You must think me ungrateful, she sobbed. I have never wanted for anything, never gone hungry, never had to do more than choose which gown to wear. My father, my brothers, you, even Artorius always took such good care of me. And I know I must pay the price for that. But sometimes I wish. She sobbed harder, unable to finish. He would think her as mad as her father, to wish for what could never be. For women to choose their fate as much as men chose their own. To live free. His voice rumbled beneath her cheek. If you had one wish for yourself, what would it be? For herself? Guinevere almost laughed through her tears. Freedom was not for her. Finally she lifted her head and said, I would wish to stay. Here, with you. Where I might finish training those falcons, fly Sir Gawain every day, and one day share a cup of your very valuable berry wine with you, when our first child is born. Lancelot laughed. You could marry a king or a prince, who would give you wine and hawks aplenty. When any other man could give you a throne and a crown, why would you choose me? He already knew her secret, so Guinevere did not know why her cheeks flamed again. I never asked for a throne or a crown. I wished for loyalty and love, the happiness of a home. All these things you have already given to me. I choose you because of all the men who might take me to their bed, yours is the only face I will see. You are the only man I desire. You and only you. He kissed her then, the heat of his lips melting hers as she gasped. His tongue stroked hers, as if to tempt her with what it would feel like if his body lay atop hers. She let out a tiny moan of longing. He took that as a signal to kiss her even harder, stealing the very breath from her lungs, until she had to tear her lips from his, lest she swoon from lack of air. He grinned, then cupped his hands to his mouth and shouted for a horse. She stared up at him dizzily. I do not understand. She'd admitted she desired him, something women were not supposed to do, and instead of answering her with words after that searing kiss, he'd demanded a horse. If we don't seek out a priest this very afternoon, I fear I will not have the fortitude to carry you inside, and even now I am tempted to make this lake shore our marriage bed. Guinevere gave a nod. Yes. They had waited long enough. She let him lift her onto his horse before he climbed up behind her, then set off at a gallop for the church. 47. The feel of her soft body pressed against his almost unmanned him, but Lancelot merely tightened his arm around her waist and urged his horse on. The sooner they were married, the sooner he could start satisfying the desire he'd seen in her eyes when they'd kissed. He did not deserve a queen like her, but if he was what she wanted, then who was he to refuse her? The priest had just sat down to an early dinner when they arrived, but a bag of coins and the promise of a whole goose to replace the stringy leg that sat on his trencher soon had him scrambling up to perform whatever service Lancelot required. Lancelot repeated the vows after the priest, not remembering a word of them, so intent was he on the fever-bright eyes of Guinevere as she promised to be his wife. It was a good thing the horse knew his way home, for Lancelot could think of nothing but the woman before him, his wife, all the way back to the castle. He lifted Guinevere from the horse, and once he had her in his arms, he had no intention of ever letting go. 48. He'd bathed, he'd changed, he'd eaten, yet Xylander felt there was something else he needed to do. He wasn't satisfied with the night's story. And Guinevere, something about the way she'd stood there, saying she wanted to stay, reminded him of the girl she'd been before their mother died and father went mad. But she was so much more than that girl now. She'd looked like the kingdom's rightful queen, not Xyrine. Yet when she'd spoken, it had been about birds. Circe had been the name of Mother's Gyr falcon, he remembered now. The bird had terrified him after it had nipped his finger, but Guinevere had wanted to take Circe hunting. Mother had promised she might when she was old enough, but then Mother had fallen ill and all her promises had died with her. Perhaps the birds and the memories they held had brought life to Guinevere again. But for how long? Xylander could not settle until he knew his sister was safe. He drained his cup of wine and set it on the table. He would find her and speak to her alone, without the interfering night around. Her husband, if he was to be believed. Guinevere would not lie to him. If she wanted a bird or a whole flock of them, Xylander would give them to her, and cage them up to take them home with her. Lubos would not begrudge her some birds. He beckoned to the servant. "Find Guinevere and tell her I wish to speak with her." The maid nodded and trotted off. It was some time before the maid returned, her cheeks flushed from hurrying to do his bidding. But Guinevere wasn't with her. "Where is she?" Xylander demanded. The maid bobbed a deep curtsy, keeping her head bowed so she wouldn't have to meet his eyes. "Queen Guinevere is resting and not to be disturbed. When she is ready, I shall give her your message, your majesty." The knight, Lancelot, was behind this, Xylander was sure of it. He'd given the order to keep Guinevere from speaking to him. Well, to blazes with that. A king outranked a knight, that much Xylander knew for certain. "Where is she?" he repeated. "Show me to her chamber." The girl squirmed uncomfortably. "This was her chamber, your majesty, until you arrived. There is only one royal bedchamber, so the master ordered her things to be taken to his chamber, as it's the next best, after this one. She is in his bed." Xylander cursed. "Show me the way." The girl led him to a closed door, then took off before he could ask her anything else. Xylander reached out to push the door open, but it didn't budge. He heard Guinevere cry out. "Resting my royal ass," Xylander thought, putting his shoulder to the door. Then he put his ear to it too, and he found he could hear another voice. "Lancelot." "Yes, my queen," the knight said. Silence for a little while. Then yes. "Yes." Her cries grew louder and more shrill. "Yes, oh Lancelot, yes." Red-faced, Xylander backed away from the door. If Guinevere knew he'd spied on her making love with her husband, king or no, she'd box his ears. Ears that could hear Guinevere's joy as clearly as if the door stood open now, her cries were so piercing. "Can I be of service to your majesty?" Xylander spun. The maidservant who'd spoken was middle-aged, and her knowing looks told him she'd seen all. Seen her king sneaking about like he hadn't done since he was a boy. Xylander straightened, trying to look regal. "Inform Sir Lancelot and his wife that I had to return to the capital, and did not have time to bid them farewell. I will send word when I can accept their invitation to hunt." When he rode out of the gates, urging his horse to greater speed as if the devil himself pursued him, Xylander paused only once to look back. Guinevere might not be happy when she found out he'd overheard her, but she was happy with her husband. Happy enough to make love with him in the middle of the afternoon, something even Xyrine, in her eagerness for children, had not managed to do. It warmed his heart to think that Guinevere would get to live happily ever after, maybe even happier than him. As she should. This has been Reflect. Snow White Retold. A Tale in the Romance, a medieval fairy tale series. Written by Demelza, Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google.